think all of us are brought to yoga because of something that's going on with us, physically, mentally, however. And what sometimes happens is that we get wonderful surprises. And Dr. Bryce Mason seeks to understand those surprises and has already done a doctorate elsewhere at the Rand Institute and is really bringing that spirit of inquiry to not just figuring out, but really communicating some of the meaning of what becomes possible through experiences within yoga. So, Dr. Mason.
Thank you. Tonight, we explore enlightenment, the conclusion of yoga. One reading, conception of enlightenment, is from the Shiva Samhita, a 13th to 15th century Hatha Yoga Sanskrit text. I read from James Mallinson's critical edition in English with some Sanskrit words. The first chapter is titled The Vital Principle. This is the concept of the Atman, a word that communicates an individual soul or spirit. It is translated as the self, though Mallinson does not capitalize it. This vital principle is to be heard and to be seen. It is the thing or the experience that grants liberation. It has the form of light. And somehow, this experience of light takes place in a void of regular sense perception. Nothing, emptiness, void. The second chapter is knowledge, and it sets up a microcosm, macrocosm relationship between the human body and the universe. The word used for body is deha. And deha, about its first 15 definitions in the dictionary, express materiality, mass, taking up space, concepts that make one consider that at least some portion of this experience is taking place in the physical world. The Shiva Samhita says the body is the means to nirvana. It is an instrument to take one there. The spine is named Mount Meru, a cosmological metaphor for the center of the universe that's used in many, many texts in the Asian diaspora. Sushumna, this white cylinder representing a very thin tunnel inside the spine, is described as a divine path. It is this pathway that must be traversed in order to experience liberation. And Kundalini, who we heard several times from our classmates, rests at the bottom of this passageway, waiting to spring up, a divine goddess, up Sushumna as a streak of lightning. from below and into the head. Of course, there's a lot of other opinions. Thousands of texts and so many descriptions that one must ponder whether anything has been said about liberation at all. What is this vital principle? Texts refer to it as bindu, this nectar that drops down the passageway and is burned up by the kanda, the sun. Or amrita, divine nectar, the jiva, the atman. Prana, we've heard several times from our classmates, the life energy being absorbed into the body. Some texts describe kundalini above or below. 1, 2, I can point to a text that shows 5 kundalinis. And where does this action precisely happen? Texts describe this experience as emanating from anywhere along this axis. What might cause one to experience the budding of the light at the top of the head? There's so many words and variability in cultural description of liberation. Though there is one unitary thread. James Mallinson and Mark Singleton, in their book, Roots of Yoga, say that of the many texts that they have read, they do see at least a couple commonalities, patterns, or even widespread consensus after a certain point in time. Those are these. The concept of a network of channels through the body that aggregate up into a central channel. These are the nadi, or the hita. And later it's just named sushumna, though one can see this central channel in very early texts and metaphors. And it is the ascent through this central channel that is a shared feature across yoga traditions. The image comes from Swami Satyananda Saraswati's Kundalini Tantra from 1984. And he describes that the inverted people tree mentioned in the 15th chapter of Bhagavad Gita and also in Rig Veda as metaphor for this experience, where the hymns of the Vedas are at the bottom and outward, extended from the nadi. And these are the experiences of the world, the external sense perception, which the yogi turns inward. And these sensations then come into the center and then rise up to a person's true roots at the top of the head. It is an unpopular area of academic research to combine the metaphors and the experiences described in these texts with a, at least then, Western understanding of anatomy and physiology. Next, we'll explore several ideas. By far, the most common idea is that somehow this experience represents directed nervous energy. This idea came from mostly medical doctors' observations in the 1800s of several fascinating experiences that yogis had performed in front of them. Things like making the heart silent, apparently stopping to beat, or being interred for 40 days, and being able to be revived after that time. Things that the doctors knew from their understanding of physiology implied some kind of involuntary nervous control. Things that were normally automatic were somehow under their control. And thus the idea was born that the chakra, the things that other students have referred to as central to this axis and this experience, that the idea was that they were somehow the nerve plexuses, these collections of nerves that are throughout these nervous system in the front of the body that run along the same axis as the spine, but out in front and control all of the organs in the body, things that happen automatically. And the idea was that somehow the yogis were concentrating on these chakra and these nerve plexuses, and that the nervous energy went backwards and then into the spine and then somehow aggregated up into the head for this experience. A lot of people subscribe to this idea, and we'll hit a few of them through our talk. My critique of this idea is that it's a little ambiguous. What is the nervous energy? How does it travel backwards along axons which normally go to the organs? And where and how does it accumulate in the spine and rise up? And then what happens? One debate that took place in this model was, what is Sushumna? So we look at two theories and ideas. On the left, Baman Basu describes Sushumna as the spinal cord. The white matter, the interior gray matter shaped like a butterfly, and the central canal in the very center, teeny 15 micron diameter space for the cerebrospinal fluid to go up and down the axis of the spinal cord. And those three things represented these interior nadi to Sushumna, Vajra, Chitra, and Brahmarandra. Vivekananda and Arthur Avalon thought otherwise. They said, no, we think that more likely Sushumna is just the central canal, and that there were even more fine and yet undiscovered fibers in the interior. They didn't have to think that they were undiscovered. Actually, one was discovered already in 1860, and it's called Reisner's fiber. Reisner's fiber deserves its own presentation, filled with intrigue and murder, and a comparison by two historians of neuroanatomy to the devil. One thing that is known about Reisner's fiber, despite its mystery, is that it is fundamental in its relationship with the central canal of the spinal cord to govern a person's vertical axis. It is the thing that creates the axis of the human in embryology and mechanically helps the body maintain that compass for what is vertical. Vivekananda's Raja Yoga sums up this model very well. He says, residual motor energy, think about sitting still in meditation, is somehow stored up in a chakra and it gets heated. And then this energy is made to rise up through the spine and one receives enlightenment. He sees a little critique, possibly in his writing. He says, he notes that the central canal does not contain any nerve fibers in order to transmit that nervous energy. So a little possible critique, but he says he's not bothered by that. And he says, nature requires no wires to send her tremendous currents. Think light, back to the lightning of the Shiva Samhita. There's a few variations on this nerve model that are worth talking about. Hiroshi Motoyama, a Shinto priest in the 50s and 60s and the 70s, who did some incredible work measuring electricity on the surface and under the skin in an attempt to justify and explore the idea of meridians and acupuncture. He had a Taoist take, and he was also frustrated by the lack of nerve fiber inside the central canal. He saw that was the dead center of the human being, but he was frustrated that it contained only cerebrospinal fluid. And so he thought the governing vessel meridian of acupuncture is by far the better association for Sushumna. Another is Satyananda Saraswati, the gentleman, the Swami that produced that amazing image of the inverted people tree. He updated anatomy and said several interesting things in addition to the chakras, nervous plexuses. He said that there's a gland at the base of the spinal cord that is involved, that somehow man can explode. He didn't go into any more detail about that, but I do wonder whether that might possibly be the terminal ventricle at the bottom of the central canal, which bulbs up a little bit into the conus medullaris, a triangle-shaped, cone-shaped thing that sticks at the bottom of the spinal cord, and Reisner's fiber goes all the way down and coils up at the bottom. He says somehow the cerebrospinal fluid gets excited in this experience. And like an electric shock from the bottom of the spinal cord, he writes of prana as measured in volts. But it is only metaphor, because he says that the energy itself is still undefined scientifically. Now, a second idea that's totally different is from this gentleman named Itzhak Bentov, who had measured heart waves in meditation, very micro motion of the heart waves. And he thought that, he was an engineer, and he thought resonance must be happening here. And so somehow these micro waves in the heart accumulate and resonate in the body several times over. And then that does a thing where it moves the head up and down in the cerebrospinal fluid. And then those waves in the cerebrospinal fluid somehow create magnetic waves around the head, turning the head to an antenna. And then simultaneously, the mechanical waves trace through the geometry of the brain around the corpus callosum, which happens to have this amazing property where if you stimulate it around this area, you might see the areas of the body. So somehow stimulating up the body in a way to express the idea of the kundalini energy of rising up the body. I have a critique of this model that there's a lot of moving parts here. A third model is that Reisner's fiber, which is only like a few nanometers wide, somehow is interfaced inside that central canal, and that's a quantum computer. And this gentleman, Lawrence Weil, actually went to medical school with the intent of trying to understand whether there was any anatomical basis to Kundalini Yoga. And he has spent 50 years studying Reisner's fiber. He's written 12 articles in a book about it, and his speculations, which he himself describes his ideas as speculations. He doesn't give too much of a how, but just some ideas. And he's fascinated by this topic. A fourth idea is by a physician practicing in Pasadena named Mauro Zapatero. He's got several YouTube videos and one article. And he sees that the central nervous system, he sees the cerebrospinal fluid as very amazing, and that in that it is simultaneously in contact with the whole central nervous system. And he sees that as already a conductor of a lot of molecules, and that this simultaneous contact might kind of explain that feeling of oneness that's described. And he says that the Kundalini awakening is a rising of the sacred energy from the sacrum into the head through the cerebrospinal fluid. So he sees the cerebrospinal fluid as integral and as somehow a conductor of this energy. But he says that the sacred energy is from the source, and it's more or less undefined. Although one time he did talk about the cerebrospinal fluid as battery. So we come to the thesis's contribution. It is time to dispense with the metaphors, because electricity is the vital principle. Consider these facts newly applied to yoga. The cerebrospinal fluid, which we have already said is in the middle of the central canal, all up and down the spine, is also present between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater, forming a bit of a shell around this. Now, whereas the cerebrospinal fluid and the arachnoid mater are highly electrically conductive. Actually, the most electrically conductive thing in the brain. And nearly 2 Bindu, I mean Siemens per meter. All of the surrounding materials of this cerebrospinal fluid, the dura mater, the pia mater, and the canal wall ependymal cells are relatively not, therefore setting up a system of insulation around the conductor. And therefore, every human being, an empirical body that is common to all of us, is this shape of cerebrospinal fluid in space extending from the mind. Well, that looks an awful lot like and is the same geometry as a coaxial antenna. And that means that all of these famous equations that govern the electromagnetic relationships in our world apply to us. And therefore, this is a bridge between the ideas of physics and psychology. Light creates current. The famous Western philosophical problem is the mind-body paradox. Jonathan Westphal, in his book, The Mind-Body Problem, paraphrases one problem, one conception or a characterization of the issue with this paradox, and he says, our minds are not in space in the very straightforward sense that the assignation of linear dimensions and locations to them or their thoughts, or their activities is unintelligible. Well, here is one thought, the ultimate thought, that has a relationship to space. Carl Jung, in his lecture of the Kundalini about a century ago, commented on this idea, saying that we cannot connect the psychical existence with the idea of anything cosmic or physical. We have not yet found the bridge between physics and psychology. Therefore, here is a new theory of the self, the Atman. It is nothing less than Ohm's law. Ohm's law is a representation of the electrical relationship in a wire. The current, I, is electrical potential divided by resistance. I, too, am potential that has been divided by resistance. Thank you.